Hi everybody, my name is Igor, and welcome to a series called Public Research. In this second episode, we're going to be looking again at some publicly available online research articles, and I've chosen one today as a contrast to the first episode where we looked at real perceptions of the world and how our brains take auditory speech envelopes and use top down processing to simulate gaps or errors in the speech envelope into a corrected form so that you can understand what you're hearing a little bit better. Now we're going to look at something a little bit different. So, this article is called Circadian Rhythms in Auditory Hallucinations and Psychosis, and it's written by Hong Viet V. Ngo, Enric Oster, Christina Andrew, and Jonas Obleser. Let's read the abstract together. Circadian rhythms are imprinted in all organisms and influence virtually all aspects of physiology and behavior in adaptation to the 24-hour day-night cycle. This recognition of a circadian timekeeping system permeating essentially all healthy functioning of body and mind quickly leads to the realization that, in turn, human ailments should be probed for the degree to which they are rooted in or marked by disruptions and dysregulations of circadian clock functions in the human body. In this review, we will focus on psychosis as a key mental illness and foremost one of its cardinal symptoms, auditory hallucinations. We will discuss recent empirical evidence and conceptual advances probing the potential role of circadian disruption in auditory hallucinations. Moreover, a disbalance in excitation and inhibition within cortical networks, which in turn drive a disinhibition of dopaminergic signaling, will be highlighted as central physiological mechanism. Finally, we will propose two avenues for experimentally intervening on these circadian influences to potentially alleviate hallucinations in psychotic disorders. And there's a few words that I want to look into here before we dive deeper. The first one is let's take a look at what psychosis is, because I personally think that a lot of the human experience can be stigmatized. So, what does that mean? That means that when you tell a research scientist or a doctor something, they can be quick to label it as a mental illness or a disorder, um, just to kind of try to categorize it. So, let's take a look at what this categorization really is. Psychosis is a mental health symptom, not a specific illness, characterized by a disconnection from reality, including hallucinations, which are seeing and hearing things, and delusions, false beliefs. It usually involves three stages: prodrome, acute, and recovery, and it is treatable with medication and therapy, often leading to a positive prognosis if caught early. So, one of the things that I'm interested in looking at here is what is the nature of this word in the first place? Psychosis originated in the 1840s from modern Latin, combining the Greek psyche, the mind, the soul, or breath of life, with osis, abnormal condition or morbid state. Coined by German physicist Ernst von Leben in 1845, it was meant to represent a mental affection or a psychic neurosis. So basically, they took the idea that somebody's mind was in a disordered state. They were trying to explain something that others couldn't really understand. So a person who says that they're hearing voices or that they're hearing spirits or that sometimes that they they can do magic or that they're they practice witchcraft, or that they're seeing ghosts, hearing all sorts of things, feeling all sorts of things that they can't oftentimes prove was there without some effort, is what we've decided to call psychosis. In here, they're exploring how your sleep cycle, your circadian rhythm, so the way that your body is naturally turning on and off, is related to the auditory hallucinations, so the things that these people are hearing. I'm very interested in taking a look at the article and seeing whether more or less sleep relates with more or less auditory hallucinations. And the interesting thing here is that if someone has a hallucination, they say they heard a voice say, hey, it's your grandma, and um, I really care about you, and I want you to be happy. And their grandma has passed away. It had to have been a ghost. If they have that hallucination, is it real? Why is it a hallucination? They can't necessarily prove it to me in a physical recording. So, what are the differences there? Let's take a look. The article here is on PubMed, so PUBMed, MED, dot ncbi.nlm.nih.gov /3674495 backslash, and I will put the link in the description. It's available here in the Wiley online library. It was posted to the Acta Physiologica journal, volume 237, issue 4, on April 2023. I will include this link in the description also. My great appreciation to the scientists and the publishers that contributed to creating this research article. Here's the DOI, and it is publicly available, so you can read along this with me if you open up the link. Auditory hallucinations are a cardinal symptom of psychotic disorders, affecting more than two-thirds of patients with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is another term that I'm going to quickly take a moment here to look at, because a lot of people think that this word is something to really panic about. Schizophrenia. I have schizophrenia. What is that? Schizophrenia is meaning split mind. So let's bring that up here. Another Greek word combining schizo, meaning split, and mind. So basically, it's saying that a person's mind or their understanding of reality is dissociated from the physical world. They're living in a dream. They're it's split mind. Their mind is split from natural physics. I could drop that pen and if the conditions are right, they'll say, no, the pen flew upwards instead of falling down. It's split from what is provable empirically, traditionally. Hallucinations thus constitute one of the main diagnostic positive symptoms of schizophrenia spectrum disorders in the two major classification systems, in distinction of the usually longer lasting and potentially more debilitating negative symptoms such as cognitive decline, anhedonia, or flat affect. I don't know what this means, so let's look. Anhedonia is the reduced ability to experience pleasure or a diminished interest in previously enjoyed activities, often acting as a core symptom of depression, schizophrenia, and other mental health conditions. It involves emotional numbness, social withdrawal, and reduced motivation, generally caused by disruptions in the brain's reward system. Treatment often includes therapy and medication. And I am very much in support of bringing people positivity and support and making sure that they feel that nowhere in society is it okay to make fun of people for having hallucinations or delusions. We should try to be understanding as research scientists and professionals. However, auditory hallucinations are not pathognomonic for psychotic disorders, as they present with significant frequency, recent estimates ranging from 45 to 60% in the context of a number of other mental disorders such as mood, dissociative, personality, and post-traumatic stress disorders, and may also affect approximately a third of patients with neurodegenerative disorders such as Parkinson's disease. So they've listed off an array of disabilities here: mood disorders, personality disorders, PTSD, Parkinson's disease, and they're saying that auditory hallucinations, which are a symptom of schizophrenia, are presenting in significant frequency with these disabilities. Due to their typically negative, e.g., derogatory or threatening content, hallucinations in psychosis cause significant distress. Moreover, their presence is associated with increased risk for unfavorable outcomes such as more severe psychopathology, suicide, violence, low functioning, and neurocognitive deficits, irrespective of diagnosis. And one thing that I'm very keen on understanding, especially with folks that have something like post-traumatic stress disorders that are experiencing these auditory hallucinations, are maybe the component that is creating the hallucination is not coming from within the subject. Maybe it's the environment, or maybe it's the projections of others onto them that are making them feel like they're being pushed out of society, that they're being mocked, that they're being threatened. I, as a research professional, am very, very hesitant to tell people that what they're experiencing isn't real, or is an illness that they have, before taking a look at the environment and taking a look at the relationships surrounding them, and making sure that they feel like they're in a safe space, that they know that there are people that um, love them and care about their well-being, so that you can say that these hallucinations are not going to come to reality wherever they're coming from, whether it be a personal worry or an external projection onto them. Strikingly, the experience of auditory verbal hallucinations, that is, hearing voices, is also not uncommon in the general population, with a lifetime prevalence of approximately 10%. The phenomenology of hallucinations is very similar across diagnoses, as well as in comparisons of clinical and non-clinical populations, suggesting that they occur across a continuum. Likewise, neuroimaging studies exploring neurocorrelates of AVH experiences revealed a similar engagement of brain networks across diagnoses or between clinical and non-clinical populations. However, differences between hallucinators with and without need for care have been observed across various neurobiological and cognitive dimensions. It seems therefore likely that the final clinical manifestation, including severity, diagnostic category, distress, and need for care, results from the interaction between a common neurophysiological substrate and other factors such as environmental risk factors, e.g., trauma. Cognitive mechanisms, e.g., cognitive appraisal of voices, reasoning biases, and emotional factors, but also biological factors such as neurotransmitter activity or brain network organization. Altogether, this raises the question, what common neurophysiological factor mediates auditory hallucinations along such a continuum? One such biological factor often overlooked in the literature and the main focus of this review is circadian abnormalities. Here the authors tie in what everything we've talked about may have to do with a person's sleep cycle, their circadian rhythm. So I'm actually even curious, what does this word on its own mean? Circadian. My first guess is that it would have to do something with the heart. Is a natural oscillation are named circadian, meaning about a day, because they tend to occur at least every 24 hours. So maybe the word really means more circular. The term circadian comes from Latin circa, meaning around, and dies, meaning day, so around the day. So their daily rhythm is more of what it's saying. Altogether, this raises the question, what common neurophysiological factor, what are the physical components in the mind, mediates auditory hallucination? So how does the brain process these experiences, these spirits that people are hearing along such a continuum? One such biological factor often overlooked in the literature and main focus of the review is circadian abnormalities. So if people are on a different daily cycle than what is normal. We hypothesize that circadian disruptions drive a disbalance of the excitation to inhibition ratio within cortical networks and a dopamine dysfunction, both causing a shift in sensory processing, which in turn lead to auditory hallucinations. To explore this putative role of circadian rhythms, we will begin by reviewing the overall link between circadian disruption and psychotic disorders and introduce dopamine as a central mediator for circadian misalignment. Putative is a formal adjective meaning generally believed, supposed, or assumed to be something, often despite a lack of concrete proof. It is commonly used before a noun to describe a reputed or alleged entity. I've never heard this word before, so very interesting here. So to explore this alleged role of circadian rhythms. Next, we will move into the auditory domain, which we will first approach by examining the evidence of auditory clocks. We will then discuss the pathophysiology of auditory hallucinations and recent empirical evidence and conceptual advances probing the potential role of circadian disruption in auditory hallucinations and specifically introduce EI, so excitation to inhibition, disbalance, and dopamine dysfunctions as central physiological mechanisms and identify recent evidence of a circadian rhythmicity. Finally, we will propose two avenues for experimentally intervening on the circadian influences to potentially alleviate hallucinations in psychotic disorders. Hmm. Dopamine dysfunction as central physiological mechanisms. Pathophysiology of and recent empirical evidence and conceptual advances probing the potential role of circadian disruption and inhibition disbalance. So, to explain these two things here, excitation to inhibition disbalance is looking at in the brain uh, a, an unevenness between what signals are boosted and what signals are suppressed. So is the they're saying that when there's some kind of irregularity that it's not all tuning the same way, and dopamine dysfunction, so some kind of irregularity in the dopamine neurotransmitter, whether or not these have to do with a person's daily cycle experiencing hallucinations. Circadian disruption, definition and effects on health. The interplay between circadian rhythms and behavior is instrumental for our health. A disruption thereof has been linked to cognitive and physical impairments or disorders. The easiest recognizable form of disruption within this framework is a shift in the sleep-wake cycle to the environmental day-night cycle, which mainly results in sleep problems and daytime sleepiness. A common cause for such a misalignment arises from jet lag, when individuals travel across multiple time zones. The lag in synchronization between internal circadian rhythms and the current Zeitgebers, both photic and non-photic, e.g. feeding times, results in disturbed sleep, daytime fatigue, hormone profiles, and changes in mood. Zeitgebers, German for time givers, are external environmental cues that synchronize an organism's internal biological clock, or circadian rhythm, to the 24-hour day-night cycle. So Zeitgebers or time givers are things that are in your environment that tell you when to sleep or when to wake up. While this misalignment is usually transient and dissipates with time, a minority of people, for example, patients diagnosed with bipolar disorder, may develop problems with realignment requiring much longer time scales up to months. An alternative cause for circadian disruption is shift work, an inevitable development driven by the access to light during the night. Accordingly, oh, long-term shift workers exhibit increased risk for cancer. Night shift workers with a prevalence of 15% to 20% in industrial societies also suffer from elevated incidence of cardiovascular and metabolic disorders, and exhibit an increased prevalence of behavioral health and psychiatric disorders compared to their day shift counterparts. Sleep disturbances and abnormal sleep-wake cycles may precede and exacerbate psychotic experiences. For example, a night of sleep deprivation in healthy participants results in significant increases in anxiety, depression, and paranoia. Sleep is not only regulated by the circadian phase, but a reciprocal influence has been shown as well, for example, sleep deprivation altering the phase of circadian rhythms. Of note, these mutual influences are not easy to distinguish. Nevertheless, circadian abnormalities are hence not only a common characteristic of inflammatory or neurodegenerative diseases. Circadian disruptions such as circadian misalignment of melatonin secretion from nighttime into daytime are encountered in the majority of patients with psychotic disorders. Sleep is so important, everyone. Make sure that as often as you can, you rest your mind. Work is a really good experience. Being rewarded for your efforts is amazing, but I highly encourage you for your lifespan and for the health of your mind that when you're tired and you have the time, go and take a break. Go and get some sleep. So, where were we? Encountered, and I wanted to take a look at here melatonin. Let's just quickly look at what is melatonin, because a lot of people mention it, but not a lot of people talk about it. Melatonin is a hormone produced by the pineal gland in the brain. I believe it's this tiny little dot in the center of the brain. Let's make sure. There it is, a tiny little dot right in the middle of the brain. Excuse me. Melatonin is a hormone produced by the pineal gland in the brain that regulates the... Oh, excuse me. I hiccuped. Regulates the sleep-wake cycle. It is widely used as a supplement for insomnia, jet lag, and resetting sleep schedules. Benefits include improved sleep onset and quality, while common side effects are drowsiness, headaches, and dizziness. The The prevalence of sleep and circadian rhythm disruptions in patients with schizophrenia lies around 80% and has thus been described as a hallmark of the disorder. These patients report a broad range of disturbances: sleep onset latency, difficulties to maintain sleep, circadian advances delays, bidian 48-hour sleep-wake cycles, and highly irregular and fragmented sleep patterns. In a similar vein, the endorsement of sleep problems was associated with an increased risk for reporting at least one psychotic symptom, even if corrected for anxiety and depression in the general population. Furthermore, it was found that difficulties falling asleep and early morning awakenings were associated with significantly higher risk of one or more reported psychotic experiences in the general population. Altogether, these disturbances are strongly associated with negative clinical outcomes, including relapse, poorer coping, higher distress, increased frequency of depression, and even complete suicide. However, circadian disruption phenotypes in patients with psychotic disorders are very heterogeneous, and the nature of the relationship between circadian abnormalities and psychotic symptoms remains unclear. More specifically, it is unknown which specific mechanisms link circadian disruptions or shifts in circadian rhythmicity to the altered perceptions and beliefs that are at the heart of psychosis, and whether circadian disruption acts as a direct mediator of state symptomatology, or rather represents a distal vulnerability factor interacting with other genetic and environmental factors to eventually lead to the emergence of psychotic disorders, or both. What is the etiological mechanism contributing to circadian misalignment in psychosis? One widely accepted notion is dysfunction of neurotransmitter systems as glutamate and especially dopamine, which has been associated as an underlying mediator of psychosis. Dopaminergic neurons in the ventral tegmental area, or substantia nigra pars compacta, are, albeit not directly, regulated by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the master pacemaker governing circadian rhythms. Intriguingly, dopamine levels can in turn feedback and influence SCN activity. There is also evidence for a modula- modulatory role of dopamine in peripheral clocks such as the striatal clock. The striatal clock refers to a specialized timing mechanism within the brain's striatum that processes short duration time intervals, seconds to minutes, and regulates 24-hour molecular circadian rhythms. It integrates dopamine-based signals to guide behaviors and functions as a molecular oscillator driven by clock genes like PER1 and PER2, distinct from the main master clock. The striatum is a major subcortical structure of the basal ganglia in the forebrain, acting as the primary input station that integrates signals from motor control, reward processing, and decision making. So here we can bring it all back together. If the area that's responsible for motor control and decision making has a clock keeping mechanism taking short time intervals like seconds and minutes and regulating it around the circadian rhythm, the daily rhythm, does signaling within that clock mechanism affected by dopamine have anything to do with a person's hallucinations? Furthermore, excuse me. Furthermore, dopamine regulates circadian rhythms via hormone production, and as it affects the release of prolactin or melatonin in the pituitary and pineal gland respectively. Importantly, the link between dopamine and sleep-wake systems is bidirectional. Dopamine signaling has diurnal rhythms, which are directly regulated by the circadian clock. Moreover, dopamine is modulated by melatonin, with melatonin specifically exerting an inhibitory effect on the dopaminergic system. Consequently, disruption in dopamine signal will affect circadian rhythms and vice versa. So, melatonin up, dopamine down. The bidirectional involvement of dopamine in the regulation of sleep and circadian rhythms implies that alterations in dopamine signaling, such as they occur in schizophrenia, would lead to disruptions to sleep and circadian rhythms. So, dopamine up, melatonin down, making it hard to sleep. Indeed, pharmacological elevation of dopamine transmission led to disrupted sleep and fragmented rest activity rhythms. Thus, dysregulation of the dopaminergic system may be a key mechanism underlying the circadian disruption prevalent in schizophrenia. On the other hand, the fact that the dopamine is also under the control of the circadian clock and exhibits sleep-dependent changes makes it likely that, in turn, circadian disruption may lead to a dysregulation of dopamine signaling. For example, sleep deprivation has been shown to cause an increase in dopaminergic activity. Altogether, dopamine is an important modulator of the circadian system, and therefore constitutes a common mechanism underlying both sleep and circadian regulation on one hand, and psychotic symptoms such as auditory hallucinations on the other. Hmm. Yeah, I'm making sure not to guess on anything that I want to say about this here. But I do believe that it's trying to tie together how dopamine, the way that it's affecting that daily rhythm, will either hinder your sleep and throw off that clock, and play some kind of role in the experience of auditory hallucinations. So let's see how they explore that. Given that circadian rhythms have been found in various organs such as the heart, stomach, or liver, the question arises how the auditory system itself is modulated by the circadian timekeeping system as well. Indeed, experiments in mice revealed that the cochlea and inferior collicus express core clock genes, that is PER1, PER2, BMAL1, and Rev-ERBA. Using real-time bioluminescence on an organotypic cochlea slice of transgenic mice, which express a PER2 luciferase fusion protein, revealed that cochlea PER2 expression oscillates in a rhythm synchronous to the SCN, in line with previous evidence from other peripheral tissues like the liver. These oscillations persisted for about a week in culture and thus corroborate a robust and self-sustained clock within the cochlea. But how does this auditory clockwork affect auditory function? Evidence on the circadian regulation of the auditory system is sparse, and existing studies were primarily performed in rodents and focused on diurnal patterns of hearing sensitivity. Acoustic startle response (ASR), a motor or eye reflex upon an unexpected salient acoustic stimulus in mice, was found to be greater in the morning than in the evening, indicating a higher hearing sensitivity during the resting phase. A modulatory role of PER2 was shown in PER2 knockout, which exhibit a diminished ASR in contrast to healthy wild-type mice. In humans, an overall identical pattern in ASR was found, that is, a greater acoustic startle response in the evening. Intriguingly, sensitivity to noise trauma follows a 24-hour rhythm but inverted variation. Comparing the recovery to noise exposure in mice during the day and night revealed a complete recovery during the day, whereas loss of hair cells and thus permanent damage was caused during the night, suggesting a vulnerability of the auditory system at night. Just wanted to make sure the salient means noticeable. Unexpected, noticeable audio stimulus. And as in the last video, I'll leave the subtitles for you to read. Despite the established evidence for auditory clocks, the central question remains to what extent these clocks play a role in the occurrence and maintenance of auditory hallucinations. The best evidence for auditory clocks localizes to the auditory periphery, i.e. the inner ear, and ascending pathways in the brainstem, for a recent review. This leaves us with a noticeable gap of knowledge between these markedly peripheral clock mechanisms thus far identified on one hand and the perceptually strikingly complex, often verbal nature of auditory hallucinations on the other, clearly pointing to relevant cortical auditory contributions. Hmm. And they're really curious to see why is it that auditory hallucinations are often also noticed to be words. It's why is there some kind of discernible language if it's quote unquote hallucination? Hmm. Thank you for sticking with me up to this point, everybody. I just want to say that your views are really appreciated. I'm looking forward to any comments or insights that you have about the video, and thank you very much for dropping a like if you want to see more like this. Note that the processes involved in perceiving verbal auditory hallucinations, such as speak recognition, pitch perception, and emotional judgment of complex sound, all point to auditory cortical contributions. To this end, we will next review the concept of auditory hallucinations in more depth and discuss potential centrally located mechanisms that may be susceptible to circadian rhythms and circadian disruption. A hallucination is defined as a percept without a corresponding sensory event in the outside physical world that causes this percept. By this strict definition, a series of seemingly unrelated perceptual phenomena can be subsumed also as hallucinations. Earworms, i.e., the often unwanted intrusive internal replay of melody fragments, or tinnitus, i.e., the often distressing percept of a ringing or buzzing tone in lieu of an acoustic signal causing it. Auditory hallucinations as a key symptom of psychosis are, first, foremost, verbal. That is, the patient perceives an often identifiable, discriminable human voice. Furthermore, a suggested taxonomy of auditory hallucinations in psychosis furthers the dimensions of language complexity, self-other misattribution, and spatial location, inside versus outside the head. Now, this is interesting. Why would you confuse yourself for someone else? Self-other misattribution is a cognitive error where an individual confuses their own thoughts, actions, emotions, or agency with those of another person, often due to a failure in distinguishing self from others. And how interesting, because would there not be a form of impersonation involved here? Impersonation involves falsely adopting another person's identity, name, or image to deceive others, often for financial gain, fraudulent activity, or harassment. So how interesting that this is an often hallucination, self-other misattribution when folks may be also impersonating others for evil. Hmm. Differences in spatial location, differences in language complexity. Second, there will be no sense of intent for auditory hallucinations. The patient usually does not intend to listen to these voices and cannot help but doing so. There's a lack of consent here. Accordingly, the voices are for most be perceived as intrusive or unwanted, as they elude the listener's voluntary control. For a detailed account of the phenomenology of auditory hallucinations as a transdiagnostic feature. Hmm. It reminds me, of the idea that your parents, if you're a human being like me, your parents made the decision to have a child, and you're born into this world also not consenting yourself in a way. You're exposed to society, institutions, your natural spaces, and it's a really amazing thing to be alive and to be able to succeed and work. And that's why I personally feel gratitude for this choice, even though it wasn't my choice. So I will work very hard, everybody, to continue to make it so that people can feel sheltered and fed and understood as we move forward. Very interesting here that there's also that they're noting the lack of consent when you are exposed to soul, right? Psyche. Accordingly, the voices are foremost be perceived as intrusive or unwanted, as they elude the listener's voluntary control. In the emerging field of computational psychiatry, the occurrence of hallucinations has been approached fruitfully from a vantage point on how the mind gathers and integrates information and forms beliefs. We here exhibit this framework in at least some detail, as it will prove useful when linking the pathophysiology of hallucinatory percepts back to disturbances of the circadian system of the patient. First, prominent computational psychiatry accounts emphasize the dysregulation of feed-forward feedback loops. I have the hiccups today. Feedback loops in sensation and perception as an explanation for the emergence of hallucination. The Bayesian predictive coding account. This has been formalized within a framework of Bayesian perception, reflected in a misalignment of prior predictions and incoming sensory evidence, prediction error in technical terms. The suggested key pathology here is thought to lie in the synaptic gain, as it would align well with the suggested multiplicative changes in the precision with which the psychotic brain encodes both perceptual prior expectations and actual sensory evidence. As the next section will elaborate, many of the demonstrated pathophysiologies in psychotic disorders center on changes to synaptic gain, such as in dopaminergic and N-methyl D-aspartate NMDA receptor function. We ran into this word in the first video as well, Bayesian, and it comes from this field. Bayesian statistics is a theory in the field of statistics based on the Bayesian interpretation of probability, where probability expresses a degree of belief in an event. The degree of belief may be based on prior knowledge about the event, such as the result of previous experience, or on personal beliefs about the events. This differs from a number of interpretations of probability, such as the frequentist interpretation, which views probability as the limit of the relative frequency of an event after many trials. More concretely, analysis in Bayesian methods codifies prior knowledge in the form of a prior distribution. So it's just taking into account what a person thinks about the statistics that they're looking at rather than absolute limits. Predictions. The suggested key pathology here is thought to lie in the synaptic gain as it would align. Oh, we've already read that. In the auditory domain, the much-studied auditory mismatch negativity response (MMN) is a marker for sensory evidence accumulation. Compelling evidence has been collected suggesting a reduction of MMN in psychosis, and that it responds to a pharmacological NMDA receptor affine interventions. Also, the strikingly high confidence with which hallucination-prone individuals hold ambiguous auditory percepts is commensurate with the Bayesian perception framework, in that overly strong prior expectations can come to dominate a relatively weakened representation of sensory evidence. This ties in well also with recent findings in psychotic and non-psychotic hallucinators, and in optogenetically manipulated mice. See next section for a detailed discussion of the dopaminergic origin of these findings. Both studies have yielded high confidence false alarms in a perceptually ambiguous auditory detection paradigm as a viable laboratory operationalization of auditory hallucinations. Second, and closely related to changes in efferent bottom-up prediction error versus efferent top-down predictions, a relative neurophysiological disbalance of excitatory to inhibitory drive in given neural populations has been proposed in empirical studies in human and non-human model systems. I'm curious about these words here. Efferent neurons or sensory neurons are nerve fibers that conduct signals inward towards the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord from sensory receptors in the body. They are responsible for transmitting information about touch, pain, temperature, and special senses, forming the arrival of side of the nervous system. So the arrow pointing towards you, afferent with the A. And that makes sense with the bottom up. Like we saw in the first video, bottom up is the small little details of the world, uh, not looking at the big picture, but looking at individual data points. Efferent neurons or motor neurons transmit electrochemical signals away from the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord towards peripheral effector organs such as muscles and glands to initiate action. These neurons are crucial for voluntary movement and involuntary autonomic bodily functions. Efferent pathways such as motor and autonomic pathways facilitate this exit of information. So, if we take our sensory neurons, the afferent ones as the inward bottom-up processes, the efferent neurons or the motor neurons, the ones that are controlling the muscles and the other parts of our body, it's the output into the external world, the arrow pointing away. Efferent with an E. Accordingly, the conjecture arises that local changes to the EI balance in the central auditory pathway are associated with a different weighing of sensory evidence, and that a relative hyperexcitability, as previously described as a general pathophysiological phenomenon in psychosis, might promote the emergence of auditory hallucinations. The conjecture arises that local changes. So they're saying that the more excited, the more active your brain is, the more likely it is that you're gonna hear a ghost. Notably, the often debilitating chronic condition of tinnitus, which can be framed as a non-verbal variance of an auditory hallucination, phantom perception, of sound, has not only been modeled also as a relative disturbance of EI balance. Second, in close analogy to psychotic hallucinations, tinnitus is currently thought of as a disturbance in a Bayesian perception, namely a relative shift in precision of perceptual priors and sensory evidence. Presumably, throughout the multiple stages of the afferent and efferent auditory pathways, until now, there is only preliminary evidence that also the subjective percepts of tinnitus might be related to individual circadian rhythms, which is to be expected if it shares core common pathophysiological principles with the emergence of auditory verbal hallucinations. Hmm, so that buzzing in your ear if you have tinnitus might get better or worse depending on your sleep. The introduction of chlorpromazine in 1950 and the description of its effects in treating psychotic states paved the way for a huge body of research that amounted to the formulation of the dopamine hypothesis, which since then has emerged as the most prominent and enduring neurobiological model of schizophrenia and psychosis in general. Chlorpromazine, sold under brand names like Thorazine, is a first-generation typical antipsychotic and phenothiazine, used primarily to treat schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe behavioral issues in children, and in some cases, severe nausea, vomiting, or intractable hiccups. It works by blocking dopamine receptors in the brain. Common side effects include drowsiness, dry mouth, dizziness, weight gain, and movement disorders. Wow, this sure is interesting. When we start to get into the drug world of therapy, I really start to want to understand why is it that we may need a chemical like this. I think, involving chlorine. Let's see, putting chlorine in your body, and I think is nitrate, right? Nitrogen, chlorine, nitrogen, sodium, sulfur. Yes. So this chlorpromazine, it's chlorine, sulfur, and nitrogen. Of course, it's going to stop the activity in the brain. In its initial version, the dopamine hypothesis postulates that psychotic symptoms such as delusions and hallucinations arise from a hyperdopaminergic state in the brain, and that antipsychotic drugs exert their effect by counteracting this state. In a similar vein, administration of dopamine stimulants in healthy participants induces psychotic symptoms. Although the dopamine hypothesis has undergone several refinements over the years, its major premise has remained unchanged. In fact, all currently licensed antipsychotic drugs have as common denominator their ability to block dopamine D2 receptors, even though they may have several effects on their neurotransmitters as well. In unraveling the relation between dopamine and auditory hallucinations, it is essential to note that, on the one hand, dopaminergic function in striatal regions is increased in schizophrenia and correlates with symptom severity. On the other hand, the discrimination of auditory information relies on projections from the auditory cortex to subcortical striatal networks. Critically, recent work reported that the rate of hallucination, like perceptions in mice, measured by the aforementioned high-confidence false alarms within an auditory discrimination task, was predicted by striatal dopamine levels. Moreover, optogenetic stimulation of dopamine release and blocking of dopamine receptors by haloperidol administration led to an increase and reduction in auditory hallucinations respectively. Haloperidol, or Haldol, is a first-generation typical antipsychotic used to treat schizophrenia, Tourette's disorder, and severe behavior problems. It works by blocking dopamine receptors in the brain to reduce agitation, hallucinations, and delusions. Common side effects include tremors, muscle stiffness, sedation, and restlessness. Let's look at the chemical composition of this one as well. Chlorine, nitrogen, looks like oxygen, right? Let's just make sure. Oxygen, chlorine, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, oxygen, nitrogen, chlorine, and whatever OH is. OH. Hydroxide. It's a hydroxide. Hydrogen and oxygen, I believe, together. And alcohol. So fluorine, oxygen, nitrogen, and a little hydroxyl tail here, and chlorine. Sold under the name of Haldol. Yeah. So they're saying that optogenetic stimulation, and let's see what optogenetic is. Optogenetics is a biological technique combining genetic engineering and light to control the activity of specific cells such as neurons in living tissue with millisecond scale precision. It involves introducing light-sensitive proteins, opsins, into target cells to turn them on or off using light, enabling researchers to map neural circuits, control behavior in animals, and develop potential treatments for neurological disorders. So they're turning on and off the dopamine in the mice and also giving them Haldol, which led to an increase and reduction in auditory hallucinations respectively. Altogether, this evidence corroborates the notion of a mediating role of striatal dopamine on the emergence of positive symptoms and auditory hallucinations in particular. Considering this established contribution of dopamine, the question arises what in turn caused the hyperdopaminergic brain state? Considering this established contribution of dopamine, the question arises what in turn causes the hyperdopaminergic brain state? Hyperdopaminergic, so an excess of dopamine. Considering this established contribution of dopamine, neuroimaging studies observed increased activation of the thalamus and hippocampus during hallucinations, which may directly influence auditory processing but also in the striatum, indicative of a widespread dysfunction of neural networks. More importantly, striatal dopamine release is mainly innervated via projections from the frontal cortex. This ties to the previously described concept of a disbalance in excitation and inhibition within cortical networks. More specifically, a lower inhibition in frontal networks leading to an amplified innervation of dopaminergic neurons in the striatum. Empirical evidence in support of this concept has been provided by administration of ketamine intervention in mice, leading to an increased synthesis of striatal dopamine, an effect that could be counteracted by activating inhibitory signals within cortical networks. Of note, ketamine intake is associated with both positive and negative symptoms in healthy individuals, as well as patients with schizophrenia. Hmm. The final question remained unanswered, is if auditory hallucinations are under a circadian influence. However, studies examining this aspect are rare or in fact allow only indirect inferences. Tracking spontaneous inhibitory postsynaptic currents in nocturnal mice across 24 hours revealed an inhibitory signal almost twice as high as during the light phase, when mice are asleep, in comparison to the dark phase, suggesting a circadian modulation of excitatory and inhibitory balance. In contrast, performance on an auditory pitch discrimination task of healthy individuals covaried with cortisol levels, a central endocrine marker under circadian regulation. Considering these findings suggests that auditory hallucinations may be under circadian influence as well. Hmm. To date, only sparse evidence is available from patients with schizophrenia, where the occurrence of auditory hallucinations was directly related to antipsychotic drug concentration during the course of a day. Strikingly, the study revealed that auditory hallucinations were not only reported most frequently in the evening, but also lasted the longest during this time of day. Intriguingly, as can be synthesized from this study, small plasmatic fluctuations in antipsychotic drug concentration appear to exhibit an antiphasic pattern relative to the circadian peaks and troughs of reported auditory hallucinations. This highlights the potentially critical, unstudied role that circadian dynamics may play in the emergence and treatment of psychosis. Recapitulating the collected evidence, circadian disruption paralleled by an excitatory inhibitory disbalance within cortical networks and an aberrant dopamine signaling poses a mechanistically plausible pathway toward the experience of psychotic symptoms, as shown here specifically for auditory hallucinations. Thus, the question arises how this insight can be utilized in treating positive symptoms in psychosis. Albeit rather speculative, we see two approaches lying close at hand. Hmm. Basically, they found that it's still not really answered the whether or not the disruptions in the sleep have a lot to do with it. Let's see. Let's go on to see what they said. The first approach relates specifically to the previously discussed antiphasic pattern. Let's just check what this is also. Antiphasic refers to a signal presentation condition where the phase of a sound stimulus is reversed in one ear relative to the other, often used in auditory tests to improve sensitivity in detecting hearing loss. Antiphasic pattern between antipsychotic drug concentrations and auditory hallucinations in patients with schizophrenia. Although conventional dosing schedules target a stable concentration of antipsychotics, the concept of chronopharmacology suggests an administration of antipsychotics adapted to individual rhythms of positive symptoms such that peak levels of antipsychotic drugs coincide with time periods during which auditory hallucination are worst. Hmm. As an ideal outcome, total dosage might be reduced on the long run if a better match with individual circadian chronotype could be achieved, at least in the initial phase before a stable plateau of antipsychotic medication is attained. Notably, to date, only one study demonstrated the antiphasic pattern between antipsychotic drug and auditory hallucination. Thus, the proposed chronopharmacological avenue warrants further work. Such future studies should move from a systematic assessment of chronotype and emergence of auditory hallucinations in clinical and healthy populations toward the essential question if chronobiologically informed therapeutic regimes can help mitigate psychotic symptom severity. Furthermore, both circadian disruptions in general and psychotic disorders specifically go hand in hand with abnormal sleep patterns and vice versa. Considering the intertwined relationship between sleep and circadian systems, a stabilization of sleep patterns is an obvious target in managing symptom burden in patients with psychotic disorders. Similarly, non-invasive brain stimulation techniques such as auditory stimulation may provide an accessible tool to facilitate sleep, that is, accelerate sleep onset or facilitate sleep depths. More intriguingly, and specifically considering the proposed central role of cortical excitatory to inhibitory ratio on auditory hallucinations, a recent study observed a modulation of excitatory and inhibitory balance across uh, period sleep. Utilizing the power spectral slope, i.e., the 1f exponent as an approximation for excitatory to inhibitory ratio in human neurophysiological data. It can be shown that a homeostatic regulation of the spectral slope toward more negative values is indicative of a net increase in inhibition. Thus, sleep represents an intriguing window of opportunity to intervene in order to counteract any trait or state like excitatory to inhibitory disbalances, and consequently the likelihood of psychotic symptoms to emerge. Sleep represents an intriguing window of opportunity to intervene in order to counteract any trait or state-like disbalances. However, on the one hand, the ramifications between sleep and circadian disruption are difficult to set apart. Thus, a disentangling, for example, via forced desynchrony approaches, can provide a critical understanding of the distinct sleep and circadian role on auditory hallucinations. On the other hand, the discoveries linking sleep and excitatory to inhibitory balance have only been made recently and are highly understudied. Thus, our understanding requires future work to address fundamental questions. How do overnight changes in excitatory to inhibitory ratio translate into changes in sensory evidence accumulation and the proneness to auditory hallucinations? Most critically, the feasibility of sleep interventions on homeostatic excitatory to inhibitory regulation and, consequently, on auditory perception remains to be demonstrated. Our synthesis of the literature demonstrates that our knowledge on the implications of circadian disruption on auditory hallucinations is only beginning to form. Despite the consensus on the importance of circadian rhythms on human mental health, we here highlight a putative, that is implied or suggested, mechanistic, so mechanical or functional link of disrupted circadian rhythms to aberrant auditory perception in psychosis via dysregulations in dopamine signaling and a disbalance of excitatory to inhibitory dynamics. They're saying here that the conclusion was that when your rhythm along the course of the day is not functioning normally according to your population, so the people that you exist with, if you're not sleeping and resting and waking, so having this excitation and inhibition in a normal way, disrupted circadian rhythms, there may actually be a functional link involved in dopamine signaling that creates more auditory ghosts, phantom noises, phantom percepts than normal. Furthermore, we propose two putative approaches to ameliorate positive symptoms in psychosis via targeted chronobiological interventions. So because there is a mechanical, there is a the dopamine pathway is what's being looked at as the regulator of these phantom signals. They are looking at chemical therapies to reduce that non-tangible. I mean that because here again I'm thinking it's not tangible, it's not physical in the external world, but the person is perceiving it. It's somehow they're receiving, somehow it's real. to them the ghost percept. So there are chemicals being explored to reduce perceptions of those spirits. Future work will need to explore these new avenues toward accessible treatments, synergistically counteracting circadian disruption and improving psychotic symptoms. Very interesting read here. Thank you very much for taking a look at it with me. And it just makes sense that if these hallucinations are triggering people's PTSD, that if it's making them feel like they're being pushed out of society, that it's making them feel depression or maybe even suicidal, we really want to figure out ways that we can uh, provide treatment and ameliorate the situations that these folks are saying that they're having. So, uh, very important to get your rest. Very important to know that uh, there's people out there that care about you and how you're doing and want to try to understand what it is that you're feeling without imprisoning you, without medicating you, without your consent. Um, let's keep working together in the world of science to understand our spiritual and our unwell and our communicative or non-communicative fellows. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the next episode.